They found the coffee cup in three pieces. That was the detail that stayed with Carla long after everything else had faded. Not the shouting, not the sound of a man hitting the floor, not the blue and red lights that washed across the parking lot later that night. It was the cup, Walt's cup, the one she filled every Friday without being asked. They're always black, never with cream or sugar, always in the same ceramic mug with the small chip on the handle that nobody had ever bothered to replace. Three pieces on the tile floor of Marlene's diner, and the coffee spreading out in a dark, slow stain. And for a moment, Carla just stood there looking at it because some part of her understood that this was easier to look at than the man who had been holding it. The paramedics arrived 11 minutes after she made the call. She stood outside in the cold with her arms crossed over her chest and watched the lights blink against the front of the building, and she thought about the fact that Walt Briggs had been coming to this diner every Friday for 12 years, and in all that time he had never once asked for anything he wasn't owed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. This story doesn't begin with broken cups or ambulance lights. It begins the way most things in this part of Ohio begin, quietly, without announcement, in the ordinary hours before anyone understands that something is about to change. It begins on a Friday afternoon in November, when the sky over Calverton had gone the color of old pewter, and the wind off the fields carried just enough edge to remind you that winter meant business. It begins with a man walking through the front door of a diner he had been walking into for 12 years, hanging his jacket on the same hook by the door, and sitting down at the same stool at the far end of the counter, the one closest to the window, the one with the slight wobble in the leg that nobody had ever bothered to fix. Walter Briggs, 74 years old. If you were sitting in that diner on that particular Friday and you happened to glance toward the end of the counter, here is what you would have seen. A man who had grown old honestly, not gracefully, not dramatically, but in the way of someone who has used himself up doing real things over a long period of time and carries the evidence of that in his body. His back curved at the shoulders, the kind of curve that comes from years of physical work and not enough sleep and the weight of things that can't be set down. His hands told every decade of his life, broad across the knuckles marked with old scars, trembling slightly when he lifted the coffee cup to his mouth. His hair had gone completely white, and he kept it combed to one side with the careful precision of a man who believed that a certain dignity could be maintained through small and consistent acts. He wore an old field jacket, olive drab faded to something closer to gray at the elbows and cuffs, with three small pins on the left breast that had long since lost their shine. The kind of jacket that told you everything about a man's past and nothing that he himself would ever volunteer. His boots were worn at the heels. He was reading a newspaper. An actual paper newspaper folded to the crossword, which he worked in ink, not pencil, a habit he had maintained for 40 years and had no intention of abandoning. He looked to anyone who didn't know better like a man the world had mostly finished with. Carla knew better. She had worked at Marlene's for 15 years, and for 12 of those years, Walt Briggs had been sitting on that stool every Friday afternoon. She knew he took his coffee, black and hot, and that he would drink exactly 2 cups over the course of the afternoon, no more. She knew he always left $20 on the counter when he left, always cash, always exact, always more than the bill required. She knew he read the local paper cover to cover and kept the crossword for last, and that he had never in 12 years left a single square blank. She also knew things Walt had never told her directly, that his wife had died of cancer when their son was 9, and that Walt had raised the boy alone while working full-time as a mechanic, that he had retired 7 years ago and maintained his small house on the edge of town with the same quiet stubbornness he brought to everything else, that he had served 22 years in the United States Army, that he had been a staff sergeant in the 75th Ranger Regiment, and that among the faded pins on the chest of that old jacket was a Bronze Star that he never discussed, in which if you asked him about directly, he would set aside so smoothly you'd wonder whether you had imagined asking. She knew these things the way you know things about people you have watched closely and respected quietly for a long time, not because they told you, but because you paid attention. She set his coffee down without being asked, and she set a small slice of pecan pie beside it that he had not ordered. He looked at the pie. He looked at her. She had already turned away before he could say anything, and she heard him exhale slowly, a sound that in 12 years she had come to understand was the closest Walt Briggs ever came to saying thank you for something that touched him. The diner was running full that Friday. Every booth occupied families waiting near the door, the kitchen about 10 minutes behind. Carla moved fast the way she always moved when the place was full, efficient, precise, not rushing because rushing made mistakes. The bell above the door rang steadily in the hour after Walt arrived. The kind of steady, familiar crowd that made Marlene's feel less like a restaurant and more like a room a community had claimed for itself. The Morrison family had called ahead. 8 people for a birthday dinner, the old man turning 70, his daughter had mentioned. Could they have the big round table in the back corner with the good light because they wanted photographs? Carla had set the reserve sign on that table herself that morning, put out extra chairs. The table was ready. Then the door opened again and the evening began its turn. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way most catastrophes begin, something so ordinary that nobody notices until later, when they are trying to understand how things arrived where they arrived. Kyle Mercer walked in. He was 34 years old and built like a man who had spent his 20s playing lacrosse and his 30s paying someone else to keep him in shape. A quarter-zip pullover and expensive blue dark trousers in the costly middle ground between jeans and dress slacks, a watch that caught the light when he moved his hand. He wore it all with the ease of someone who has never had to calculate whether he could afford a thing. 2 friends came in behind him, both around his age, both cut from the same cloth, dressed in the way that communicates membership rather than taste, already smiling at something Kyle had said outside. A woman came in after them, younger, walking slightly behind the group, laughing at things half a beat after the others laughed, still calibrating. Kyle did not look for a host. He did not look for an open table. He walked through the diner with the unthinking ease of a man who has never waited for anything in a room he entered, and he went directly to the large round table in the back corner. He picked up the reserve sign, held it a moment, set it on the floor face down against the wall, sat down. His friend sat down. The woman sat down. Someone opened a menu. Carla set down what she was carrying and walked over. "I'm so sorry," she said, keeping her voice professional. "This table has a reservation. There's a family coming in for a birthday, 8 people they called ahead this morning." Kyle looked up from the menu. His face was conventionally handsome in the way that had served him well in most rooms and had therefore never been required to develop much beyond that. He looked at Carla with the expression of mild, patient attention of someone listening to a GPS recalculate. "How many in their party?" 8, but we're 4. He looked back into the menu. "Find them something else." "Sir, they made a reservation specifically for this table. The gentleman is celebrating his 70th. Then they should have gotten here earlier." He turned to Paige. "Can I get a water?" Carla stood there one moment longer. She was very good at her job, and part of being very good at her job was knowing when a conversation had ended. She turned and walked back toward the counter. At the far end, Walt Briggs had not looked up from his crossword. Kyle Mercer and his group settled and ordered drinks spread out in the casual, expansive way of people who have never had to make themselves smaller to fit a space. The conversation was loud enough to carry across the room, not shouting, just the natural volume of people who have never monitored their own noise because they have always assumed the space around them exists for their use. 15 minutes passed. At some point, Kyle stood and walked toward the counter, apparently looking for something, or perhaps simply moving through the space because it was his nature to move through spaces as though they belonged to him. He passed behind the counter stools, past Walt Briggs, and slowed. He looked at Walt the way people look at things they are deciding whether to bother with. The old jacket, the worn boots. The man bent slightly over his crossword pen, moving in slow, careful letters. "Hey." Kyle's voice was not unkind. That was the thing about it. It was the voice of someone who genuinely did not consider what they were doing to be unkind. "You waiting on somebody, kids coming to pick you up." Walt did not look up. "I'm talking to you, old-timer." The pen kept moving. One of Kyle's friends called something from the back table and laughed. Kyle smiled over his shoulder, then looked back at Walt. "Little hard of hearing, maybe." He said it to fill the silence, then walked back to his table. Walt set the pen down. He did not turn. He stared at the window and the gray sky beyond it for a moment, and then he said in a voice pitched low enough that it didn't carry past the nearest 2 stools, "I heard every word you said." The woman on the adjacent stool glanced over. So did the man 2 stools down, Frank Garrett, a broad-chested fellow in a flannel shirt who had been eating his burger and minding his own business. Frank looked at Walt, then across the room toward Kyle's table. Kyle had not heard, or had chosen not to. Walt picked up the pen, went back to the crossword. The Morrison family arrived at 6:15. 8 of them, 4 generations if you counted the baby sleeping against her mother's shoulder. The old man, Harold Morrison, wore a green sweater and his good shoes. His wife had put effort into her hair. The grandchildren wore the particular stiff, slightly too formal clothes of kids told this was a special occasion and to please be careful. Carla met them at the door and explained the situation. She was good at her job, which meant she explained it in a way that didn't assign blame openly, and she watched Harold Morrison's face do the quiet internal work of adjusting expectations without making anyone feel worse than they already did. Not a problem, Harold said, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime not making problems where he could avoid them. Wherever you can fit us. They were heading toward a pair of smaller tables near the kitchen when the stool at the far end of the counter scraped back. Walt Briggs stood up. He moved through the diner with unhurried certainty the decision already made nothing to discuss. He walked to where the Morrison family had stopped, and he looked at Harold Morrison and said without preamble, "Take my seat. It's the best spot in the house window. You can see the whole room. I'll move down." Harold looked at him, at the field jacket, at the pins on the chest. Something crossed the old man's face that was more than gratitude, a recognition, one weathered thing acknowledging another. "I couldn't take your seat." "You're not taking it, I'm giving it." Walt looked at the grandchildren. "He's not having his birthday dinner at a table by the kitchen." Harold Morrison took Walt's hand and held it a moment with both of his. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Walt moved to a smaller stool closer to the register. Settled in, signaled Carla for a refill without looking up. Across the room, Kyle Mercer had watched all of it. He watched with the expression of a man who has not been challenged exactly, but who has been diminished by the actions of someone he already dismissed. The expression of someone finding that a category he had assigned no longer fits and unwilling to consider that the problem was the category. He leaned across the table and said something to his friends. They laughed. 20 minutes later, he pushed back his chair and walked to the counter. He lowered his voice to the register of a man who wants to sound reasonable. "That old man, how long has he been sitting here?" "Mr. Briggs is a regular. He comes in every." "Has he ordered anything since he got here, anything besides coffee?" Carla looked at him. "This is a business," Kyle said, "not a waiting room. If he's not ordering, he's taking up space that paying customers could use. Let him know, please, or I can talk to Marlene directly." "Mr. Mercer, I'm not being rude about it. I'm just explaining how businesses work." Carla looked at him for one long moment. Then she turned and went to the back. She pushed through the kitchen door and stood against the wall in the space between the prep station and the dry goods shelves, and she closed her eyes and she breathed. Then she took her phone out of her apron pocket, pressed record, and walked back out. She positioned herself near the register where the angle was right, looking like she was checking the order screen. She started recording. Kyle Mercer, after a few more minutes at his table, stood up again. This time he walked directly to Walt. He stood behind him. Let the silence build. Then he said loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear clearly, "Hey, old man, it's time to go." Walt did not respond. "I'm talking to you. I said it's time to wrap it up and head home." Frank Garrett, who had finished his burger and ordered apple pie and had been sitting quietly, looked up. He looked at Kyle. He looked at Walt. His face did something slow and deliberate. Kyle stepped closer. He reached out and gripped Walt's shoulder and turned him around, not gently. He gripped the old jacket and pulled, and the stool scraped hard against the tile, and Walt Briggs found himself facing Kyle Mercer with the crossword still in his hand and the pen still in his fingers. His face showed nothing, not anger, not fear, not surprise. A steady, complete stillness that Carla would think about for a long time afterward as the most controlled expression she had ever seen on a human face. Kyle looked down at him. Walt looked up at Kyle. For a moment, Kyle hesitated. Something in those eyes that had no bottom to it, that looked at him the way you look at something not quite in the same category as other things you have faced. Then Kyle's jaw set and he pushed, both hands flat against Walt's chest, and he pushed. Walt went backward off the stool. He hit the floor. The sound of it, a 74-year-old man going down hard on tile, stopped every conversation in the room at once. Not gradually. All at once, like a switch thrown. The coffee cup went with him, struck the floor, and broke into 3 pieces. Kyle stood over him. His face had gone red and his chest was moving fast, and there was something working in his expression that had gone past anger and past performance and arrived at something uglier, the formless territory beyond both. "Shut up, old man." His voice had changed, lower, committed. The voice of someone who has done something they cannot take back and has decided to own it. "I told you to go home. Next time somebody tells you to go home, go." The room did not move. Harold Morrison had risen from his seat at the window table, both hands pressed flat on the surface. His wife had her hand over her mouth. The 7-year-old grandson was watching with the wide, very still attention of a child trying to understand something none of the adults around him were explaining. Carla stood with her phone in her hand, barely breathing, recording all of it. Frank Garrett had put down his fork. Walt Briggs lay on the floor of Marlene's diner on his back, the field jacket spread around him, the crossword still in his right hand. He stared at the ceiling for 1 second, 2 seconds. Then he rolled to his side. He put one hand flat against the floor and pushed himself up. Nobody helped him. He didn't look like he wanted help. He moved with the slow, absolute deliberateness of a man for whom getting up is not a question, only a matter of how long it takes. He got to a sitting position on the floor. He looked up at Kyle Mercer. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that Kyle had to lean slightly forward to hear it, and so did the people nearest them, and what they heard was this: "You just knocked down a man who carried 8 of his people out of a desert in the dark when nobody else was left standing. Carried them one by one under fire on foot alone. You think a push from you is something I haven't already been through." He didn't say it with heat. He said it the way you state a fact that is simply true and has always been true and will continue to be true regardless of what anyone in the room chooses to do with it. Kyle said nothing. "You can push me down on this floor every Friday for the next 20 years, Walt said. "I will get up every single time." The silence had weight. Frank Garrett stood up from his stool. He was a big man, broad through the chest and shoulders, the kind of solid that comes from a lifetime of physical work. He walked over and put his hand under Walt's arm and helped him up, and Walt led him. And they stood there together without speaking, and Kyle Mercer took one step back and then another without appearing to notice he was doing it. Kyle caught himself. His jaw set again. "You want to make this a whole thing, fine." He took his phone out. "My father owns the building this restaurant sits in. You understand what that means." He turned away and put the phone to his ear. Walt reached up and straightened the collar of his jacket. He looked down at the broken cup on the floor. He looked at the keffy spreading across the tile. That was when Frank Garrett saw it. Walt was adjusting his sleeve, pulling it back down over his wrist, and in the moment before the fabric fell back into place, Frank saw the tattoo. Old ink, decades old, faded from black to the blue-gray. That old tattoo's reach, still legible if you knew what you were looking at. A skull wearing a beret. 2 letters beneath, worn nearly smooth but present. Frank stared at it. He had grown up in a house where a certain name was spoken with a specific reverence. He had a photograph on his desk at home, his brother Bobby at 22 in uniform, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. Bobby Garrett, who went to Kuwait in January of 1991 and came home in February in a casket 3 days before the ceasefire. Frank looked at the tattoo. He looked at the jacket. He looked at the pins. His voice when it came was not loud. "Are you Walt Briggs?" Walt looked at him. "Staff Sergeant Briggs, Desert Storm, 75th Rangers." A long pause. "Yeah," Walt said. Frank stepped back 1 step, not from fear, but from the physical adjustment a person makes when the world has rearranged itself around information they weren't prepared for. He looked at Kyle Mercer across the room with his back turned, working the phone call that was going to resolve this problem the way he resolved most problems. Then he looked back at Walt. Something moved across his face that was very far from his usual expression. The kitchen door swung open. Marlene came through. She was 60 years old and she had run this diner for 22 years on the strength of practicality and stubbornness and a specific love for the place that had never required her to examine it too closely. She had the expression of someone who has just received a phone call that placed her between 2 things she could not hold at the same time. She walked to Walt. She could not meet his eyes at first. She stood in front of him and looked at a point just to the left of his face. "Walt, I'm sorry. Richard Mercer called me and She stopped. "I need you to go home tonight." The room was still watching. Walt looked at her. He looked for a long time, long enough that several people became uncomfortable, and his expression was not angry and not hurt and not forgiving. It was something quieter and more permanent than any of those things. The expression of a man who has just had a truth confirmed that he had long suspected and hoped not to have to know. He nodded once. He took his jacket from where it had shifted during the fall and straightened it across his shoulders. He reached into his pocket and placed a folded 20 on the counter. He looked at Carla. She was still holding her phone. Her eyes were wet. Then he did something that nobody in the room expected. He bent down and picked up the 3 pieces of the broken cup from the floor, all 3 of them carefully, and set them on the counter beside the $20. He walked to the door. He stopped. He turned and he looked across the diner, not at Kyle Mercer, not at Marlene, but at Harold Morrison in the window booth. The old man was standing, both hands pressed flat on the table, And there was something in his face that Walt held for a moment, some mutual recognition between two people of a certain age of what had just happened and what it meant and what it could. Walt nodded at him. Harold nodded back. Walt pushed through the front door and stepped out into the cold. The parking lot was lit by two overhead lights that buzzed in the November air, and the sky beyond them was full of stars. Walt stood on the front step and breathed. Just breathed. His hands were not shaking. His jaw was set and his back was straight, and he was looking at the empty road with the expression of a man who has stood in worse places under worse conditions and has long since made his peace with what it costs to keep your word to yourself. He sat down on the front step. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out his phone, and an older model, simple, the kind that does what a phone is supposed to do without trying to be anything else. The screen lit up in the cold air. He opened his messages. He found a contact. He typed 4 words, read them back once, and hit send. He put the phone in his pocket, rested his hands on his knees, and looked out at the road and the flat, dark fields beyond it. Inside the diner, his stool sat empty by the register. The $20 and the 3 pieces of broken cup were on the counter where he had left them. Kyle Mercer was finishing his phone call. Frank Garrett had sat back down at his table but was no longer eating. He had his own phone out and he was typing something, and his face in the glow of the screen was doing something complicated and still. At the far end of the parking lot, the road into Calverton ran long and straight and empty. For now, it was 6:47 in the evening. By 7:30, that road would look entirely different, because 38 miles away in a garage outside a small town nobody had heard of, a man named Jackson Briggs had read 4 words on a phone screen, had set down the wrench he was holding, and had walked outside without saying anything to anyone. The 4 words were, "Can you come now?" Jackson Briggs was 44 years old. He was the son of a man who had never, not once in his life, asked anyone for help. Not during the years after his wife died, not through the lean years, or the medical bills, or the 100 small emergencies that had come and gone without anyone outside that house ever knowing they had happened. Not once. Until now. Jackson read the message a second time. He stood in the cold outside the garage. Then he made a call. Then another. Then another. And far away on the front step of a diner in Calverton, Walt Briggs sat alone in the dark and waited, and in the distance, very far away, too far to be certain yet, there was something. A sound, low and rhythmic and growing. Walt sat very still, and he listened, and something in his face that had been locked behind that careful stillness for the entire evening changed. Not much, just enough. Frank Garrett came through the front door and stood on the step beside Walt. He didn't ask permission. He came out and stood there a moment, looking at the same empty road, and then sat down without saying anything. 2 men in the cold dark, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that belongs to men who have reached the age where they know that some moments don't need filling. The overhead lights hummed. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked at something it had decided was worth its trouble. Wind moved through the bare elm tree at the edge of the lot. "I recognize the tattoo," Frank said finally. "On your wrist." Walt waited. "My brother wore the same one, Bobby Garrett." Frank paused. "He was 22, February of 91, 3 days before the ceasefire." The name settled into the cold air between them. Walt was quiet for a while. When he spoke, his voice was level, the way a man's voice gets when he is handling something he has handled many times and has learned to carry without dropping. "Bobby G." A pause. He had a way of laughing at things that weren't funny yet, like he saw the punchline coming 10 seconds before anyone else. Always cold even in the desert. Said he'd rather be in Alaska. Frank made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. "That's him. That's exactly him." "He was a good soldier." Frank nodded. He pressed his hands together. He talked about the guys in his unit. Never used last names, just nicknames the way soldiers do. But there was one he mentioned more than the others. Just called him Sarge. Said if he ever got into real trouble, Sarge was the man he wanted next to him. Walt said nothing. "Was that you?" A long pause. "I don't know what he told you." "He told me enough." The wind moved through the elm again. The dog down the street had stopped. "I'm sorry about your brother," Walt said. "I know you are. I've known that for 30 years without ever meeting you. Bobby made it clear." Frank looked at the road. "I just never expected to end up sitting on a step next to you outside a diner in Calverton, Ohio." "Life has a sense of humor," Walt said. "Mostly the kind that isn't funny yet." Frank looked at him. "You sound like Bobby." Walt almost smiled. Almost. They sat a little longer. What Frank did not say was what he had already done before coming outside. what he had already read alone at his table while his apple pie went untouched. He had typed Walter Briggs' 75th Rangers Desert Storm 1991 into his phone. The first result was a piece on the website of a veterans support organization out of Columbus, a retrospective series published each year around the anniversary of the Gulf War ground campaign. Stories about men and women who had served and come home and were, as the organization put it, still with us, whether or not the country happened to be looking. The piece was called The Man Who Came Back Last. Frank had read the first 3 paragraphs and stopped, then read them again, then set the phone face down on the table and sat very still for 30 seconds, doing the internal work of adjusting to something that changed the proportions of everything he had already been looking at. Then he read the rest. The article was not long. It didn't need to be. In plain and careful language, it described what had happened on the night of February 26, 1991, in the southern Iraqi desert during the 3rd night of the ground campaign. A 9-man Ranger reconnaissance unit inserted deep behind enemy lines to locate a heavy artillery position, the ambush that hit them less than 200 meters from extraction, the communication blackout that left them without air support for the first 4 hours. What Staff Sergeant Walter Briggs had done in those 4 hours in measured language, drawn from eyewitness accounts. He had not retreated, he had not called for extraction, and waited. He had gone back, multiple times, into the fire, into the dark, in a desert he could not see the edges of alone on foot. He had located each of his men. He had carried 3 on his back. He had dragged 2 more. He had moved through hostile ground for 6 consecutive hours, making the same route again and again until everyone was accounted for. He came out last. 8 people came home because of what he did that night. His citation for the Bronze Star described exceptional valor under sustained hostile fire. The man who submitted the citation, a then-captain named Thomas Richards, had recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Walt Briggs had declined in writing on the grounds that the outcome had not warranted the designation. The article ended with a photograph. Recent. Walt Briggs standing in front of a garage with his arms crossed, looking at the camera, with the expression of a man who had agreed to this as a concession rather than a choice, and who wanted whoever was looking to understand that. Frank had stared at that photograph for a long time. Then he had looked across the diner at Kyle Mercer, laughing at something one of his friends said. Then he had stood up and come outside. He didn't say any of this to Walt. He just sat there on the step beside him in the cold, because some things don't need to be said to be understood, and because the man beside him was the sort of person who would find the words more burden than comfort. Inside the diner, Carla was standing behind the counter with her phone face up, watching the video play back on the small screen. She watched it once, then again. The second time she paused it just before Kyle pushed Walt, and she looked at Walt's face in the frozen frame, that expression, that absolute unbroken stillness, and then she put the phone in her apron pocket and pressed her hands flat on the counter and stared at the wall. Marlene came up beside her. Marlene was not a woman who touched people easily or often. She was practical and direct and had run this diner for 22 years on those qualities and had never had cause to regret them. But she put her hand on Carla's shoulder. "I know," she said. "He's been coming in here for 12 years, Carla said. "He sat at that same stool for 12 years, and he never once—" She stopped, started again. "He never asked for anything. Not once, I know." He picked up the broken pieces of the cup and set them on the counter. "Did you see that? Because he didn't want anyone to have to clean up after him. Even after what just happened, he was thinking about—" She stopped. Marlene's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. "Show me," Marlene said. Carla took out the phone, pressed play, handed it over. Marlene watched without speaking. Her face didn't change much while she watched, but her jaw set slowly, and by the time the video ended, she was holding the phone with the careful control of someone making sure they don't do anything to it that can't be undone. She handed it back. "Do you remember 2014, Carla asked. Marlene was quiet. "When the bank wouldn't renew and you thought you were going to have to close. Do you remember who came to you before you'd even told most people what was happening?" Marlene closed her eyes. "He didn't make a thing of it. He sat right there where he always sat, and he drank his coffee, and at the end he put a piece of paper on the counter and told you to bring it to the bank. That was the whole conversation." "I know what he did. He saved this place. He saved our jobs." Carla's voice went tight. "And tonight you told him to go home." Marlene opened her eyes. She looked at the empty stool, at the $20 and the 3 pieces of broken cup. She did not offer an explanation. She was not that kind of woman, and this was not that kind of moment. "Go call him back in," she said. Carla looked at her. "Go to the front door and call him back in. Tell him I want to talk to him. What about Richard Mercer? I'll deal with Richard Mercer. The register of her voice had reached the point past which she did not soften. Go get Walt. Carla untied her apron. She walked to the front of the diner and pushed the door open and stepped outside. She stopped. Walt and Frank were still on the step. Neither had moved, but something had changed in the quality of the silence between them because both men were looking in the same direction down the long, straight road that ran into Calverton from the east, and they were very still. Carla stepped out and followed their gaze. The road was dark beyond the parking lot lights. The fields on either side flat and black under the November sky. But at the far edge of visibility where the road bent before the long straight run into town, there was something. Light. Multiple points of it. Moving. And beneath the wind under the ambient noise of the evening, there was a sound. Low. Rhythmic. The sound of large engines running in concert, throttled down, but present the kind of sound that travels a long way on cold, flat ground. Carla stood on the step and listened, and after a moment she understood what she was hearing. She had grown up in this part of Ohio, and she knew the sound of a single motorcycle on a highway, and she knew 3 or 4 running together, and this was neither of those things. This had depth to it, had mass, suggested a column of something significant moving through the dark. She looked at Walt. He was still watching the road. His hands rested on his knees. His face held its composed stillness, but something that had been very far away in his eyes for the past hour was slowly returning. Walt, she said, Marlene wants you to come back inside. He didn't answer immediately. She means it, Carla said. She wants to talk to you. Give me a few minutes, he said. The lights at the end of the road were closer now. The sound had separated from the background noise and become its own distinct thing, layered textured a wall of low mechanical sound that occupied space in the air the way a storm occupies the horizon. Frank was on his feet, looking down the road with an expression that had moved past curiosity into something more complicated, the look of a man doing a calculation and arriving at a number that surprised him. The lights resolved out of the dark. First 2, then 4, then more. Headlights paired low to the ground, moving in a column that stretched back farther than Carla could see from the step. Moving at an even pace, not fast, not slow. The deliberate progress of something that is not in a hurry because it does not need to be. The column turned onto the main road into Calverton and came toward the diner. Carla counted the pairs of lights as they came and stopped counting at 30, because the column was still coming and she understood she had significantly underestimated what was approaching. The lead bike pulled into the parking lot and stopped. The one behind it stopped. One by one down the length of the column, engines cut. The silence built from front to back, each engine dropping out in sequence until the last one died, and the whole thing was still 99 machines arranged along the road and in the lot and down the side street beside the diner, and the only sounds were the cooling tick of metal and the wind in the elm tree. One person dismounted from the lead bike. He walked toward the diner without hurrying. Taller than Walt, broader through the shoulders, moving with the economy of someone who has learned to do everything at the minimum required energy and has internalized that lesson completely. His hair was dark with gray at the temples, cut short in the way of a man who has kept it that way for 20 years out of habit. His jacket was black leather, well used, and on the back was a patch, a skull, in a beret, the same image Walt carried on his wrist, rendered larger, and in the worn colors of something that had been through weather. He walked up to the step and stopped. He stood in front of Walt Briggs. He looked at his father the way a person looks at someone they have been worried about from a long distance and are now close enough to check cataloging, noting the set of the shoulders and the line of the jaw, looking for the things Walt would not say, and that Jackson had learned over 44 years to find without being told where to look. He found what he was looking for. He noted it. He kept his face steady. You said, "Can you come now?" Jackson said. "In 44 years, you never sent me that message." Walt looked up at his son. "I know. So I came." "I see that." Jackson looked at the diner behind his father. He looked at the lit windows and the people visible inside at the parking lot and the long, still column behind him. "Tell me what happened." Walt told him, briefly, without embellishment, in the order things occurred. He did not editorialize or inflate or diminish. He laid out the facts the way you lay out tools before a job in the sequence you'll need them. When he finished, Jackson was quiet. Then, "He put his hands on you." "He did." "He pushed you down." "He did." Jackson looked at the diner window. His face had not changed much during Walt's account, but there was something working behind his eyes, doing its work quietly, the way a tide works, not visibly but continuously with the accumulated force of a great deal of water. "Are you hurt?" "No." Your elbow. Walt looked at it, a bruise developing at the joint purple and red. He had set it aside and apparently forgotten to pick it back up. It's nothing. Okay. Jackson looked at the column behind him. 99 machines and the people on them, waiting without being told to, with the patience of people who have learned how to be still in difficult situations. Let's go inside. You don't need to make a whole thing of this. I know. These people have nothing to do with Dad. Jackson used the word quietly the way he had used it since he was small, not as a formality, but as the specific thing it actually was. Let us come in. Walt looked at him. Jackson waited. After a long moment, Walt stood up from the step. He was stiff from the cold and the fall, and he rose slowly. Jackson put out a hand, and Walt took it for just 1 second before finding his own footing, and that second the hand taken and released was the most that either of them showed of the thing between them that had no name but that both of them carried. Walt straightened his jacket. He looked at the diner door. They better order something, he said. Carla's had a long night. Jackson almost smiled. He turned back to the column and made a single unhurried gesture. One movement of his hand, and 99 people began to move. They came in without rushing, without noise. The door opened, and they filed through one after another, and they did not cluster or crowd or announce themselves. They found open seats, pulled chairs from empty tables, filled the booths that had emptied as the evening wore on. They did it with an orderliness that was not practiced, but habitual, the way you move through spaces when you have spent years in spaces that required you to know where you were at all times. Carla stood inside the door and watched them come in. In 15 years, she had developed a detailed and reliable intuition about rooms and the people who filled them. She could read a table within 90 seconds of approaching it. She could feel a room shift before most people noticed the shift. Standing at the door of Marlene's diner watching these people come in, she felt the room change. Not threateningly, not with aggression or display, something more fundamental. The room became, in the space of 3 or 4 minutes, a different kind of room, one in which the prevailing weight was redistributed, in which the space Kyle Mercer had been filling with his confidence in his father's name was now surrounded by 99 people who had between them been in rooms Kyle Mercer could not have imagined. Frank Garrett had come back inside. He was at the door watching the people come in, and his face was doing something Frank Garrett's face did not ordinarily do. He recognized June Hartley. Medium height, close-cropped, hair posture of someone accustomed to physical precision. He knew her from a local news segment 2 years ago, a story about veterans outreach. The segment mentioned she had served 2 tours in Iraq with a military police battalion and had received a commendation for pulling 2 wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle. He recognized Earl Decker. Large 50s gray hair, a long scar along the chin that looked like old shrapnel. The name connected in Frank's memory to something his brother-in-law had mentioned once, a man who ran search and rescue operations in Mosul and brought out 11 people in 3 days after a building collapse. Then Frank looked at the person coming through the door last. He came in, slowly compensating for the prosthetics with a practiced adjustment that had long since become simply how he walked. His hair was white, perhaps 70 years old. His jacket bore the same patch as Jackson's, the skull and the beret, and beneath it were other patches, smaller, faded, the accumulated markings of a very long career in a very specific profession. Frank pulled out his phone, found the article, looked at the 3rd paragraph, found the name he was looking for. A then-captain named Thomas Richards, who had submitted the original commendation, who had been standing at the extraction point in the pre-dawn dark when Walt came out of the desert with the last of his people. Frank looked at the white-haired man making his careful way through the diner. He went to his wife in their booth and leaned down. That's Thomas Richards. She looked at him. Who is Thomas Richards? Frank sat across from her. He looked at the article, then at his wife. He's the man who was waiting for Walt when Walt came back out, he said. He recommended Walt for the Medal of Honor. He set the phone down. He's been with these guys ever since. His wife was quiet for a moment. Frank? Yeah. That young man who started all this tonight? Kyle Mercer. He has absolutely no idea what he walked into, does he? Frank looked across the room at Kyle Mercer, who had gone very still in his chair, in the way of someone realizing that the environment around him has changed in ways he did not anticipate and does not yet fully understand. No, Frank said, he doesn't. Marlene had come out of the kitchen. She stood in the middle of her diner and looked at the 99 people settling in at the booths, filling at Carla, already moving between tables, taking orders with the focused efficiency of someone who has recalibrated her evening and is not going to waste another moment. She looked at Walt, who had come back in and was sitting at the counter, his stool, The one with the wobbly leg with his hands flat on the surface and his jacket still on. She looked at her diner. For 22 years, she had run this place, built it into what it was through early mornings and difficult decisions and the specific stubbornness of a woman who believes a thing worth building is worth protecting. And she had almost lost it once in 2014 when the note came due and the bank said no, and she had been sitting in the back office at 10 at night with the numbers in front of her and nowhere to put them. And Walt had come in that Friday as he always did, and at the end of the afternoon, he had folded a piece of paper and left it on the counter with his $20. She had opened it after he left. A co-signer agreement already signed with a note in Walt's plain block handwriting, "Take this to Harrington at First Federal. Tell him I sent you. He'll process it." He had never mentioned it again. Not once in 12 years had he suggested she owed him anything. Not once used it as leverage or currency, or even as the quiet foundation of a favor. He had done it and returned the following Friday and sat at his stool and ordered his coffee and gone back to his crossword as though nothing had happened. Marlene looked at the broken cup still on the counter, looked at the $20 beside it. She walked to the counter and sat down on the stool next to Walt. He looked at her. She could not make this into something it wasn't, and she was not going to try one. "Walt," she said, "I should not have done what I did tonight." He waited. "I was afraid. Richard Mercer owns this building. When he calls, I—" She stopped. She was not the kind of woman who made excuses and was not going to start. "There's no version of what happened that makes it right. I asked you to leave after what that man did to you in a place you've been coming to for 12 years, and that was wrong, and I'm sorry." Walt looked at her for a long moment. "You didn't put me on the floor," he said. "No, but I didn't help you up either." The words sat between them. Walt looked at the broken cup on the counter. He reached out and straightened one of the pieces, the small automatic adjustment of a man who still instinctively tries to put broken things in order, even knowing they can't be repaired that way. "Marlene," he said, "yes, you make the best coffee in Calverton." She looked at him. "That's why I come here every Friday," he said. "Has nothing to do with anything else." Something in her face that had been held tightly for the past hour began slowly to let go. "I'll make a fresh pot," she said. She stood up, went to the kitchen door, stopped and looked back at the room, at all of it, the full dining room, the 99 people, the ordinary, extraordinary noise of a place that had gone from nearly empty to completely full in 15 minutes. She looked at Kyle Mercer's table. Kyle was very still. His friends had moved their chairs slightly away from him, without appearing to notice they had done it the way people put distance between themselves and the origin of a storm without wanting to acknowledge the storm. The woman who had come in with them was gone. His phone was face down on the table. He was looking at the surface. Marlene pushed through the kitchen door. Marlene came out of the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee. She set it on the counter, refilled Walt's mug, refilled Richard's, and stood for a moment with both hands flat on the surface, looking at the room with the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is done postponing it. She untied her apron, folded it once, set it behind the counter. Then she walked across the diner to Kyle Mercer's table. Kyle saw her coming. He straightened slightly, the automatic response of a man accustomed to authority walking toward him. His two friends looked up briefly and looked away. Marlene did not sit down. She stood at the edge of the table and looked at Kyle Mercer with the directness of a woman who has understood through 22 years of hard experience the difference between things that can be smoothed over and things that cannot. "The man you put on the floor tonight," she said. Her voice was even, not cold, not raised. The voice of someone who has decided exactly what needs to be said and is now saying it. "His name is Walt Briggs. He's been coming into this diner every Friday for 12 years. In 12 years, he has never been anything but decent to everyone in this room. Never asked for anything he wasn't owed. Never made himself a problem for a single person." Kyle opened his mouth. "I'm not finished." He closed it. 12 years ago, when I was about to lose this place, Walt Briggs drove to the bank and co-signed a loan that kept this diner open. He did it without being asked. He never mentioned it again. Not once in 12 years. Not as leverage, not as a favor owed, not even as a subject of conversation. She held Kyle's gaze. "I don't tell you that to make you feel a certain way. I tell you because you should know who you were dealing with tonight, and you didn't bother to find out before you decided he didn't matter." Something moved in Kyle's face that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite anger and lived in the complicated space between them. "You're aware that your father owns this building. I've known that for 22 years, and it hasn't changed how I run this place, and it isn't going to start tonight." A pause. "If that conversation needs to happen, we'll have it. But that's not tonight's business. She held his gaze one moment longer. Tonight, I'm telling you that you made a serious mistake in a place where people have been coming for a long time, and what you do with that is up to you. She turned and walked back to the counter. The table behind her was very quiet. One of Kyle's friends said something low, and Kyle did not respond. He was watching Marlene's back, and the expression on his face had lost the shape it had worn all evening, the automatic confidence of a man who moves through rooms expecting them to arrange themselves accordingly. It had gone out of it, not dramatically, just gone. He looked across the room at Walt. Walt was not looking at him. He was at the counter with both hands around his coffee mug talking quietly with Thomas Richards, and he was not performing his indifference. He simply genuinely was not thinking about Kyle Mercer. And that Kyle was discovering was considerably harder to sit with than anger would have been. Kyle pushed back his chair and stood up. He walked to where Jackson was standing near the end of the counter. Jackson saw him coming from the moment Kyle rose. He did not move toward him and did not move away. He waited with the settled patience of a man for whom waiting has never been passive. Kyle stopped in front of him. "I want to explain. You pushed my father off a stool." The words were quiet, no emphasis. "The way you state something that is simply true and has always been true and will remain so regardless of what comes next. I wasn't trying to somehow, man. You put your hands on a 74-year-old man and pushed him onto the floor." Kyle stood with whatever he had prepared dissolving in his mouth, the specific helplessness of a man whose language has failed him in a room where it never had traction to begin with. Then June Hartley stood up from the table behind Kyle. She was not imposing in any physical sense. But she rose from the chair the way certain people rise, unhurried, complete, with the ease of someone for whom standing in a difficult room is not a new experience, and the room shifted slightly around the fact of her standing. Earl Decker stood from a table to the left. Then a man near the window. Then another by the door. One by one, without signal, without looking at each other to confirm it, people rose from their seats around the room. Not everyone, perhaps 15 or 20. They rose and stood and were still, and nobody moved toward Kyle and nobody said anything, and the room rearranged itself around the weight of their standing in the way rooms do when something fundamental has shifted. Kyle looked around. He looked at their faces, their ages, the quality of their stillness, the way each held their own space without needing to occupy his, and something happened in his expression that he was not accustomed to. Something went out of it that he had carried without knowing he was carrying it for most of his life. He turned and walked back to his table. He sat down. Carla was at the end of the counter. She had her phone in her hand and she held it up, not as a threat, not pointed at anyone, just held the way you present a plain fact that doesn't need decoration. "I have video," she said, "from the moment Mr. Mercer stood up to when Walt picked himself up off the floor. I started recording when I thought things were going somewhere they shouldn't." She looked around the room once. "I haven't done anything with it. I'm not saying I will." She put the phone in her apron pocket and went back to work. Thomas Richards stood up. He did it deliberately, accounting for the prosthetic with the adjustment that had long since become simply how he moved. He rose to his full height and turned toward the room, and the room, which had already been attentive, became something different. It was a quality Richards had carried for 34 years, and that retirement had not diminished the quality of a man who has given orders at moments that had immediate and irreversible consequences. It lives in the way a man stands, in how much space he takes without trying to take it. He did not look at Jackson. He did not look at Walt. He looked at Kyle Mercer. "I'm going to say something," Richards said. His voice was not loud. It carried anyway. "Not because you asked, and not because I think you've earned it, because it needs to be said in this room tonight, and I'm the one here who can say it with the most authority." Kyle was watching him. "I served 34 years. I commanded good men for most of those years. Some of them were better than good. A few of them were the kind of men you spend the rest of your life being grateful you stood next to." He paused. "The man sitting at that counter is one of them. I've known Walt Briggs for 35 years. I was there the morning he came out of the desert after the night that earned him that Bronze Star, and what I saw that morning is not something I will describe because there are no words for it that wouldn't reduce it, and it does not deserve to be reduced." The diner was completely still. "You looked at him tonight and you saw an old man in a worn jacket taking up a stool you wanted. You decided in about 1 second who he was and whether he mattered." Richards held Kyle's gaze without hurry. "I'm telling you with the full weight of everything I have seen in this life that you were as wrong as a person can be. And the reason it matters, the reason it isn't simply a question of this particular man, is that you carry that habit of looking everywhere you go. You walk into rooms and you decide who matters before you've learned anything about them. Most people you look at that way aren't Walt Briggs. They're just people. A waitress on your feet all day, a family at a table by the kitchen, a regular on his usual stool. He paused. They don't need to have earned your attention in some special way. They just need to be people. That's the whole requirement. He sat back down. He picked up his coffee. He did not look at Kyle again. The door opened. Richard Mercer came through it. 64 years old in a jacket that told you something about the distance between the man who had sat at Walt's kitchen table in 1987 and the man standing here now, wearing the expression of someone who drove here quickly after a phone call and is now taking in a room far more complicated than the call suggested. He stopped. He looked at the room, the 99 people, the settled quality of the quiet, the arrangement of attention, and something recalibrated in his face. He saw Thomas Richards at the counter. He went very still. Richards turned his head. He looked at Richard Mercer for a moment. Then he nodded once, the small nod of two men with a long shared history acknowledging each other across a room. Richard Mercer stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then he walked to the counter. He did not go to Kyle. He stood beside Walt. Walt did not turn. Richard pressed his hands against the counter edge. He looked at the surface at the wear near the edges where years of elbows had worked it smooth and seemed to be arriving at something he had been circling for a long time. Walt. Nothing. Walt, I'm sorry for what my son... Walt set down his coffee mug, turned on the stool. He looked at Richard Mercer with the same undeflected attention he'd turned on Kyle. No anger in it, no appeal, no softener. Just a man looking at another man and seeing him plainly. 1987, Walt said. You came to my house at 10 in the evening. My boy was asleep down the hall. You sat at my kitchen table and told me the bank had said no 3 times and you didn't know what else to do. A pause. My wife made coffee. She was already sick by then, we hadn't told many people. But she got up and she made coffee and she sat with us while we went through the numbers. You remember that? Richard's jaw worked slightly. I signed the paper because you were a man trying to build something right, and the bank was wrong about you, and I had the ability to help. That was the whole reason. I never thought you owed me anything for it. Walt's voice was level. I'm bringing it up now not to make you feel bad and not to call in any debt. I'm bringing it up because I want you to understand something. Richard was very still. You built something real, Walt said. The work was real and the years were real, and I mean that none of that is nothing. But somewhere between that kitchen table and tonight, your son grew up believing that what your family has excuses him from being careful with people, from looking at someone and deciding they matter before deciding whether they're in his way. He paused. I'm not saying you taught him that. I'm saying you're the only one who can unteach it. And looking at him right now, I think you already know that. Richard Mercer looked at his son. Kyle was at his table, his 2 friends now fully separated from him in the careful way of people establishing that their proximity was coincidental. His phone was face down. He was looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a young man who has for possibly the first time been left alone with the full weight of something he did. Richard left the counter. He walked to his son's table. He stood at the edge of it. He did not sit down. Stand up, he said. Kyle looked at his father. Stand up, Kyle. Kyle pushed back his chair and stood. Walk over there. Richard indicated the counter and Walt with a brief motion of his head. For a moment visible complete, Kyle stood with the frame of who he'd been all evening, meeting the reality of what that had cost him. And the meeting was not comfortable, and everyone in the room saw it, and nobody looked away. Then he walked. He crossed the diner. He stopped beside the counter. Walt was facing forward, not performing his not looking, simply not looking. I want to apologize, Kyle said. Walt did not respond. I pushed you. You went down on the floor because of me. He stopped, looked at the counter. When he spoke again, something had come out of his voice that had been in it all evening, the reflexive authority of a man who has always assumed the room is organized around him. There's nothing I can say that makes that into something other than what it was, and I'm not going to try. I'm sorry. The room waited. Walt was quiet for a long time, long enough that the silence became its own weight, and Kyle stood in it without moving, which was perhaps the first genuinely patient thing he had done all evening. Then Walt turned. He looked at Kyle directly without filter, the full plain attention of a man seeing another man rather than the situation surrounding him. And this time, for the first time tonight, what was in it was not indifference and not judgment. Something closer to recognition. The acknowledgement of a human being standing in front of the thing he had done and not running from it. "Sit down," Walt said. He indicated the stool beside him. Kyle sat. Walt looked at the counter for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, addressed to Kyle rather than the room. "How old are you?" 34. "I was 35 in 1987, working in a garage off Route 9, raising my son alone because my wife had died 3 years before and there wasn't anyone else to do it. No connections, no name that opened things for me. Skills I'd learned in the service and enough stubbornness to show up every morning." He looked at the counter. "I'm not telling you that so you'll feel guilty about what you have. What your father built is real, and what you've been given from it is yours. I'm not here to take any of that from you." Kyle said nothing. "I'm telling you because of the way you walked into this room tonight, the way you looked at Carla when she explained about the reservation, the way you looked at that family, the way you looked at me." Walt turned and held Kyle's gaze. "You looked at people and decided in about 1 second whether they were worth your time. And you came down on the wrong side every time all evening. Not because of who we were, because of what we looked like to you." Kyle's hands were flat on the counter. "The problem isn't that you were wrong about me specifically," Walt said. "Most people you look at that way won't have the kind of story I have. They'll just be people. A waitress who's been on her feet 8 hours. An old man eating his birthday dinner in the booth you wanted. A regular on his usual stool." He held Kyle's eyes. "They don't need to have earned your attention in some special way. They just need to be people. That's the whole of it." He paused. "You can do better than what you showed in here tonight. I think you know that, or you wouldn't still be sitting here. The rest is yours to work out." He turned back to his coffee. "That's all I've got for you," he said. Kyle sat a moment longer. Then he stood slowly and went back to his table. His father was near the door. The two men looked at each other with the particular expression of a father and son at the beginning of a long conversation that is not going to happen tonight, but that has, in this room, become unavoidable. Then Richard Mercer held the door and Kyle walked through it. Before he followed, Richard looked back at the counter at Walt, at Richards, beside him at Jackson standing nearby, and he held that image for a moment in the way of a man filing something away that he knows he will need to find later. He walked out. The door closed. The room breathed. Not with celebration or release. Just breathed the way a room does when something pressing against it moves away and the air finds its way back into all the places it had been crowded out of. Harold Morrison reached across the birthday table and put his hand over his wife's. She turned her hand and held his. Carla was behind the counter with her back to the room, wiping down the surface with more focus than the task required because it was the only way she could manage her face right now. She heard the stool scrape. Harold Morrison was at the counter. Alone, his family at the table behind him, his wife watching with the settled understanding of a woman who knows when her husband needs to do something by himself. He was 70 years old today. Green sweater, good shoes, white hair, hands that had worked a long time. He stood in front of Walt. Walt looked at him. Harold Morrison put his hand on Walt's shoulder. He held it there not briefly, not as a gesture, but as the real and full thing it was. Then he went back to his family, back to the window table, and the 3 generations waiting for him, and he sat down and put his arm around his wife, and she leaned into him. Carla watched this. Then she looked back down at the counter and pressed her hands flat against it and breathed through her nose. The evening moved toward its end. People left the way they had come in without ceremony. They settled their bills in the direct, uncomplicated way of people who know the value of what's been provided and are glad to pay it, and made their way to the door. Several stopped near Walt on the way out. Not for speeches, not to perform their departures, just to stop briefly in the vicinity of the man at the counter to mark the fact of him, to let him know by proximity that they had been here and had seen what they saw and that it would go with them. Earl Decker stopped. He looked at Walt. He set his hand on the counter near Walt's hand, not touching, just placing, and then he went out. June Hartley stopped. She said something quietly to Jackson, too low for Carla to catch, and Jackson nodded, and she was gone. Thomas Richards was among the last. He rose carefully from the stool and stood a moment beside Walt. The thing between them that had lived for 35 years in the specific knowledge of what they had shared in the desert, in the dark, at the edge of everything, was in the air between them, fully needing nothing added to it. "Next Friday," Richards said. Walt considered it. "I'll be here. I might stop by." "Door's open." Richards put on his jacket. He walked to the door of Marlene's diner and went through it, and he was visible for a moment through the window. The white hair, the careful, steady walk, and then the dark took him. Carla moved through the emptying room, clearing tables, collecting the small evidence of the evening. She reached the big round table in the back corner and found tucked under the edge of a water glass a folded napkin. She opened it. Two sets of handwriting. A child's first large, effortful, uneven but legible. Thank you to the nice man at the counter for giving Grandpa his seat. Below it, in a steadier, adult hand, he made Grandpa's birthday. Grandpa will talk about this man for the rest of his life. Thank you for being here tonight. Carla stood at the table for a moment. Then she carried the napkin to the shelf behind the counter, the one where Marlene kept the small framed photograph of her late husband, early years of the diner chalkboard menus, different stools 22 years ago. She set the napkin beside the photograph. She took Walt's $20 bill from where it had sat untouched all evening and placed it on top. Marlene came out of the kitchen. She stood at the end of the counter, drying her hands, and she looked at what Carla had arranged beside her husband's photograph. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went back into the kitchen and came out with a fresh cup, the specific one, the one with the small chip on the handle, and she set it at Walt's place on the counter for next Friday. Go home, she said to Carla. I'll close up. I don't mind staying. I know, go home, Carla. Carla got her coat. She stopped at the counter in front of Walt. Good night, Walt. He looked up from the crossword, completed every square, the ink dry and definite in the way of things that are finished and finished right. Good night. Get some sleep. She went out. The parking lot was cold and still. Carla sat in her car a moment before starting it, looking at the lit windows of Marlene's diner, at the sign above the door, at the ordinary face of a place that had held something extraordinary tonight and would open again tomorrow at 7 and be to most people who walked in simply a diner. She started the car and drove home. Inside the room was quiet. Walt and Jackson sat at the counter, two stools, father and son, with the easy silence of people who have long since stopped needing to fill every space with sound. The kitchen sounds were faint through the closed door. The diner settled around them. Jackson said, "You ready?" Walt looked at the counter, at the empty stools on either side, at the shelf where his $20 and the napkin were sitting beside Marlene's photograph of her husband, at the three pieces of the broken cup still arranged where he had left them. Almost, he said. He sat a little longer in the quiet of the emptied diner on the stool he had been sitting on for 12 years, with the particular stillness of a man saying goodbye to an evening, not permanently but for tonight, and understanding that some evenings are worth a moment before you leave them. Then he stood up. He was stiff from the cold and the fall, and he rose slowly, and Jackson was beside him without comment. And the hand his son put out was there if Walt needed it, and Walt didn't take it, but he saw it, and after a moment he had his feet under him, and his back straight, and his jacket settled across his shoulders. He looked at the shelf one more time. He walked to the door. Jackson held it open. Walt stepped out onto the front step of Marlene's diner. The November night was cold and full of stars, the flat Ohio sky coming all the way down to the horizon, the way it does out here where the land doesn't interrupt it and the sky comes down to meet it fully. The parking lot was empty. The last bikes had gone. The overhead lights hummed. He breathed. Behind him, Jackson came through the door. He stood beside his father on the step. They were quiet together, looking at the road and the dark fields beyond and the cold and the stars. Next Friday, Jackson said. I'll come earlier, have coffee with you. I start at 4:30. I know when you start. Walt looked at the road a moment. Then, I'm glad you came, he said. Quiet, brief. The voice of a man for whom saying such a thing requires no difficulty, but still requires a decision. Jackson looked at his father, at the white hair in the starlight, at the set of his jaw, at the way he stood when he thought nobody was measuring him, shoulders back, chin level, taking up his full height. Dad! Walt looked at him. Jackson held out his hand, straight direct between two men. Walt looked at the hand for one moment, then he stepped forward and put his arms around his son. Jackson went still for just a beat, one heartbeat of surprise, because this was not something Walt did, had never in 44 years been something Walt did. And then he brought his arms up and held his father, and Walt's grip was stronger than Jackson expected, the grip of a man who has held on through things that most people don't know the weight of. Walt stepped back. He put both hands on his son's arms, a brief firm hold, and then he released him and straightened his jacket and turned toward the parking lot. 4:30, he said. 4:30, Jackson said. Walt walked to his car. He got in. He sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, looking out at the road through the windshield, and whatever he was thinking, he kept to himself, which was where he kept most things and where they were generally safest. He drove home, through the quiet streets of Calverton, past the closed storefronts and the lit windows of houses where people were finishing their evenings, past the gas station at the edge of town, with its white fluorescent circle out onto the highway toward the small house he had lived in for 30 years and maintained with the same steady attention he brought to everything. He parked, he went inside, he hung his jacket on the hook by the door. He moved through the quiet house in the way of a man who has lived alone long enough to have made peace with what it sounds like and what it doesn't. He went to bed, he slept. In the weeks that followed, certain things changed in Calverton. Kyle Mercer did not return to Marlene's diner for nearly 4 months. When he came back, he sat at a small table near the door. He ordered a full meal, left a generous tip, and said thank you to Carla when she refilled his coffee, not automatically, but in the way of someone who means it and has thought about the difference. One afternoon in early spring, he found her in the parking lot after her shift and said he was sorry for what had happened. She said she heard him. She left it there. Sometimes that's all you can do with an apology. Sometimes it's enough. Richard Mercer called Marlene the following Monday. He told her the lease would be renewed for another 10 years when the current one expired at the same terms, and that she should let him know if anything in the building needed attention. He did not mention Walt. She did not mention him either. Some things are understood between people without needing to be spoken. Frank Garrett started going to the cemetery on Fridays. He would park on the side road near the hill where Bobby was buried and walk up and stand there for a while, not long, never long. He would set down a small bunch of flowers, say what he had to say, and walk back down to his truck. Sometimes on the way home, he would drive past Marlene's diner. Through the window, he could usually see the man at the end of the counter, the white-haired man, in the worn jacket with his newspaper sitting in the same place he had been sitting for 12 years. Frank never went in on those Fridays. Seeing the light in the window and the shape of the man at the counter was sufficient in the way that certain things are sufficient simply by existing without requiring you to do anything further with them. And Walt Briggs came back every Friday. He hung his jacket on the hook. He sat down at his stool, the one with the wobbly leg that nobody had ever bothered to fix. He spread his newspaper on the counter and worked the crossword in ink, starting with the clues he knew and working toward the ones that would require more thought the way he had always done it. Carla set down his coffee without being asked. Black, hot, no cream, no sugar. She set a small piece of pecan pie beside it that he hadn't ordered. He looked at the pea. He looked at her. She had already turned away. He heard him exhale slowly in the way she had learned over 12 years to understand. The chip on the handle of the cup was in the same place it had always been. Some Fridays there was a second cup at the stool to his left, already poured and waiting, and at 4:47 or 4:50 or somewhere in that neighborhood, the bell above the door would ring, and Jackson would come in and sit down, and they would drink their coffee together in the comfortable, unhurried silence of two people who have nothing left to prove to each other and nowhere else they need to be. The stool with the wobbly leg, the crossword in ink, the coffee black always there before he asked. The same as it had been for 12 years. The same as it would be. Some men make their mark on the world loudly in the way of people who need the world to confirm it back to them. And some men simply show up, week after week, year after year, in the same place, in the same chair, with the same quiet faithfulness to small and ordinary things. And they carry what they carry without putting it down and without asking anyone else to help with the weight of it, and they remember what they remember on the days they have chosen to remember it, and they are present in the rooms they enter, in the full sense of the word present, the way very few people ever manage to be, because they have already been through the things that teach you how. And sometimes in a room full of people who think they know who matters and who doesn't. One of those men will sit at the end of a counter and drink his coffee and say nothing. And the room will never be quite the same after it finds out why.